thanks for joining us today with everything going on in the world, thinking about, inclusiveness, diversity. When we chose to do this topic, we realized, after the fact, it is Juneteenth. So, really important day to also have this conversation around diversity and inclusion. So excited to have Kimberly Bryant, someone who's joined us on our stages at our physical events before. So excited to have her as part of the conversation. At this point, I will hand it over to David to moderate the conversation with Kimberly.
Thank you, Josh. And thank you so much, Kimberly Bryant, for being here with us today. It is a historic time, so it's really gratifying that we can touch on some of the issues that this historic time implies for the industry that we spend so much time thinking about and talking about, which is the tech industry and business more broadly. Kimberly is a longtime activist in that regard. We are honored we've had you on our stage before, but I think we really just want to hear you talk about the work you've done and the work you're doing and the work you'd hope to do, Kimberly, in light of this moment. And I wanted to just begin by asking you to explain a little bit about what Black Girls Code is, what you're doing now, and how you see what you're doing potentially affected by the changed environment we are in, if you agree that it is changed.
Great question. Thank you so much, David, and for Josh for having me here with the Techonomy community again. As we have talked before, so it's great to be able to engage with you in this setting. So for those who are unfamiliar with the organization that I founded, Black Girls Code, we are a nonprofit organization that was really started right here in the Bay Area, right here in San Francisco, not too far from where I am now, in Bayview Hunters Point in 2011. And it was driven really off of what I found to be my experience as a woman of color in the tech industry, as well as what I saw for my daughter who was going into middle school and really starting to have this hunger to learn more about tech and really get into it and really found that was her passion. And when I was looking really for opportunities for her to participate in summer programs, extracurricular activities, and learn more about computer science, I found that those spaces were not diverse. They were really lacking in diversity. And I found it shocking and very troubling because, as an engineer myself, I spent, 30 plus years by that time in my career in a very male dominated field, and thought that if any place it would be different, it would definitely be different here in the Bay Area. And it wasn't. And it's 20 plus years later, and it was probably just as bad as it was when I was going to college. And it was really that discontent with what I saw that would be a potential possible path for my daughter that led me to found BGC in 2011. We really formally incorporated in 2012, and that's when we started to grow our organization. We were, in the beginning, primarily a chapter-based organization with chapters in different cities in the US. We work from January to December and all times in between in those chapters to teach girls ages 7 to 17 from underrepresented communities about everything tech. So that could be artificial intelligence, that could be mobile app development, that could be robotics, but really giving them exposure and skills in order to be a part of the tech industry. I think, that's the fundamental basis of what we do, but we also really want to create an opportunity for our students to become self-confident. I think one of the biggest issues in being in a space in which you are a minority is that there is certainly issues around self-confidence, feeling of belonging that we wanted to address in the community that we were building within Black Girls Code, to create and nurture the resilience that our girls already have, so that when they are in these spaces, that are not diverse, they already have enough self-confidence to push through those barriers that they will inevitably encounter. And so the organization has really grown with that general premise. And over the last, it's almost 10 years, it'll be 10 years for us next year. We probably reach upwards of 20,000 students all over the US and the world, and continue to see our girls now graduate, go on to college, and enter the field. So for me, I absolutely find that this is a transformational moment. I think I was actually talking to my daughter, who's 21 now and is a major in computer science and going into her junior year. And I was talking about how in the beginning, it's interesting now that we're in this moment, or whether maybe it's a moment, maybe it's a movement. Hopefully it is a movement. But we're in this space where new supporters and communities are finding us, Black Girls Code, because our name is Black Girls Code. Like I don't want to, downplay the fact that we've done a lot of very hard work over the last 9 years. But it's not lost on me the fact that when we started, the amount of vitriol we received because our organization was called Black Girls Code, it was immense. We had potential funders ask us to change our name, and we said, no, we will not, because this is the reason. This is a term of self-empowerment for our community and for our girls. Now people are finding us by way of that work and the foundation that we've laid over 9 years. But also, it's kind of easy. If you search for Black Girls Now, we are there. You Google search, we pop up. And I think it's somewhat ironic that now the thing that was the barrier for us doing this work in the field now is the one that's shining a light on the hard work that we've done over the last 9 years, and bringing so many more people into our tribe, into our community of supporters. And so I think our work is extremely relevant. I think sometimes folks will look at organizations working in the tech ed space with communities of color and not see our work as being relevant to racial justice and social justice, but it is. You and I spoke about this when we were prepping earlier this week, and it's fundamental that we have a diverse technology industry. Fundamental, because everybody all over the world is locked in their house right now. We're in quarantine, and tech has never been more important. It's important on the streets for the protesters and how they're utilizing technology to spread this movement. It's relevant for the teachers and the students that are home, attempting to continue the learning process. Tech is fundamental, and access to tech and being able to be a part of what tech has created is fundamental in this movement and in this transformation, if you will, that we're encountering. And so I think our work is vital in terms of making sure the folks that are creating that technology are, as Douglas Rushkoff says, not just the consumers of it, but also the creators. So code or be coded. And I think that whole process of making sure our girls have a seat at the table, that they're building those tables in the tech industry, has never been more important and really vital to the work that's happening right now around us.
That was a great intro. Well, let's talk a little bit about the tech industry. It is striking if you look at the results of the poll. A lot of them are possibly predictable. A lot of people feel like their company is taking sufficient steps, which is interesting, but that would also imply that many people here are not with major tech companies, because the final question, the overwhelming majority of people say the tech industry ought to be ashamed of itself with regard to diversity and inclusion. It's a pretty depressing picture in tech. I think we ran an article at Techonomy last week that said and you have this data, Kimberly, but of the top 75 companies in Silicon Valley, 3.1% of employees are Black. That's shameful. And we're at the point where even the NAACP is urging a boycott of Facebook advertising, among other groups right now, for a month coming up. because their speech policies have been harmful in the view of that group. And there have been a lot of comments that if there was more diversity at the table in companies like Facebook, those decisions might have gone another way. Talk about the industry that you've come to know, both as an employee for 30 years, but especially as an activist for the last 10 years. And how would you characterize it?
I think I look at the tech industry as an industry that, I don't know, I think we struggle with our aspirations around what we believe we are and the conflict of how we actually do show up in society. I was reading an article a week or so ago, and it mentioned something about, to the effect, we've all heard it before, that tech is here to solve all the problems in the world, and we have this power and we can solve systemic racism. And I was like, no, you cannot solve systemic racism. Tech is not able or capable, and in many cases, I think even willing to solve some of the most vital issues in the world today. Because I think if we wanted to, then we would do better. We would do better. I don't think that we're as altruistic as we believe we are, which is why we need more voices and more diversity of experience in those seats. I do think that we also have a blind spot around our own issues. So over the last couple of weeks as well, I've seen many tech companies, with statements around Black Lives Matter. I've seen statements around Juneteenth, companies giving an employees off for Juneteenth. And I find that quite interesting, and even more tangibly, companies that are in the tech industry making, large six-figure donations to racial equity focused organizations and still are struggling internally to support their own workforce. I'm still seeing these stories about women of color, Black women, Black men, Latino men and women that are encountering issues of discrimination in some of those companies making the loudest statements. And I find that to be troubling because I don't think the issues are necessarily all external to the companies that we all are surrounded with and may work with. It's like fix your own house before we kind of go fix these houses in the neighborhood. And I'm not seeing that happen. And when I look at the poll, I'm in adamant agreement with the items that were listed on number 3. Like, all of these things are necessary. Internal programs need to be fortified within the culture of the companies that are in the tech industry. There needs to be aggressive training and advancement programs, all of these things. Every single one of them is vital. And yet, when things happen as they did, as the protests erupted around the US and abroad, I saw an external lens from these companies rather than a multivariate approach that would address a commitment to changing issues right within their own internal companies, as well as seeding the environments and the communities that are surrounding them.
Well, you'd say the tech industry alone cannot solve systemic racism. Do you think the tech industry itself is systematically racist?
Absolutely. Without a doubt, it is. I was on one of my favorite tech tools, Twitter. I spend a lot of time on there, and I like it and I hate it. I got a love-hate relationship, like many of us, with Twitter. But someone tweeted something about changing, using this moment to create more diversity and inclusion. And they started, I think, at senior level, like C-suite. And I was like, oh, no. It really should begin with the boardroom, because governance and authority and the power that gives by who sits in your boardroom and who really governs how you show up as a corporation. When we look at the boards of most of the major tech companies, they are not diverse. They are not diverse by gender. They're not diverse by race. There's stark issues of inequities at the very top level. And that really, I think, is replicative of what we see in all the rest of the levels of the organization, especially in positions of power. So in the C-suite, in the senior leadership ranks, et cetera. And that's a problem. That speaks to systemic issues within the industry that don't encourage diversity and inclusion, and don't encourage advancement of women of color, men of color, et cetera. And I think that we are definitely in an industry that breeds, that really breeds some serious and feeds in many ways with the things that we have created. Some of the many systemic issues that we see on platforms, when these hate groups are able to have a voice, when disinformation is able to be a part of the daily conversation. We're feeding and creating the communities that create the racist societies and issues that we see in our world. So absolutely.
And I know you feel that just even have, if a board is 12 people, having one Black member is probably tokenism to some degree. But I just also want to note, we mentioned Facebook before, they did add a Black board member about 2 years ago who actually disagreed with corporate policy and was kicked off, which is very emblematic of the kind of thing you're describing.
Yes. And when we were talking, I mentioned, we were talking a bit about Alexis Ohanian and his decision to step off of the Reddit board. And I mentioned that initially, Alexis has been a supporter of Black Girls Code for a very long time, but initially I was torn about that because I know that he has long been a diversity advocate and an ally. And it worried me, especially at a company like Reddit, that we wouldn't have that voice on the board. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I like that he's stepping off. We need that voice because allies are vitally important. I still believe that, but when I was reading like some of his comments about his why, he mentioned the symbolic nature of him giving up his seat so that a voice and diverse voice could come and take that seat. And I think that made me look at his decision much differently. I think some seats need to be given up. I think some seats need to be added, from the C-suite on down. And I think only when we allow those voices to actually wield some of that power, it's about a power shift. And I think until we get to where companies and organizations and government, legislative bodies, et cetera, are ready to shift some power, I don't think that this moment will actually be a sustainable movement and real transformational change.
One thing that would be useful, I think, is for you to talk about the most effective things that you've seen in the work you've done or the work that others have done because I know you collaborate with a lot of, and you're very familiar with many other groups that are working in similar ways. What have you seen that works best? Where do you see, I hope, some place for optimism that programs, policies, educational system change can make a difference?
Well, when we talked about this and you asked if I had any ideal company that I would say that is really getting it right, and I was like, no, absolutely not. I think that many companies have done many things. Some of them have worked, some of them have not. I haven't seen really sustainable change. I often quote this statistic that over the last 4 years, I think it is, there are less women, Black women in particular, in leadership positions in the tech industry than when we founded Black Girls Code. So that's a problem when we see that even with all these focus on seeding programs around bias and seeding programs and adding a diversity and inclusion champion on the senior leadership team at companies, hiring a diversity advocate, having diversity groups within these companies, we're still going backwards. Like change has not happened. into not sustainable change, at least. So that to me speaks again to the systemic issues that we're addressing. And I often say I think I'm hopeful, but change will come. But I don't think change will be sustainable until the diversity numbers, like the numbers of people drive culture. So until these companies and these cultures are more diverse, so there's more diversity of experience and who's in the company at every level, until that shifts, I don't think we'll see any real lasting change in the industry, which is why I really am still doing this work 9 years later, is because I want to ensure that these young women that we are nurturing within Black Girls Code can become the policymakers, can become the leaders in this company that will drive those changes, so that there are advancement programs that really bring these leaders up into the organization, so that there is really a true pipeline that's supported for all levels and positions, not just the administrative ones or the non-tech ones. We need Black and brown folks to be in the tech IT departments. We need to be there until we really have diverse VCs, where we really have a diverse and equitable funding for Black founders. All of those things need to happen. And as companies that are billions of dollars in capitalization, I think that they need to be a part of the solution.
We have a couple of really good questions that I want to go to in a second. But before we do, this issue of pipeline, I want you to just comment on. I mean, you are working hard to feed the pipeline at the earliest stage, right? But I would presume you would strongly argue that there are candidates that are being overlooked now. Just talk about, it's not, companies might say, oh, I can't find a Black employee. How do you respond to that?
That's a great question. I think for myself, it's always been a push-pull conversation with even my peers that are in the nonprofit industry and working in the pipeline and ed tech, that no, there isn't a pipeline issue. And to some extent, they are correct. So we're graduating double digits of Black and brown students that are graduating with bachelor's degrees in CS already. We are graduating in double digits, maybe like 15, 18% or something of that nature. I'm not saying that is women. African-American women are only receiving about 3% of the tech degrees and bachelor's of science degrees in computer science. So the number is very low based on, compared to our peers. For white women, that number is about 13, 12%, something within that frame.
Still low, but yes. Yeah.
Very low, which is much lower than it was when I graduated, when it was about 30%. So all of that says that yes, there is a pipeline problem because that is not enough to fill the open positions and the future positions that will be available in the tech industry. So the reason I advocate to develop and grow this pipeline is because the pace of growth in the tech industry still outpaces every other industry vertical. So we cannot fill it with women or people of color with the low numbers comparatively to white men that are graduating with those degrees. On the other hand, when you and I, we talked about that 2.3% or 2 to 3% of African-Americans in the tech industry, that's a magnitude less than the available talent that is been proven to be in the field now. Yeah. So why are we not representative of what our actual participation is in the industry right now? I'm a heavy LinkedIner. I'm an open LinkedIn networker. And I always find it amazing that the number of Black men, Black women, Hispanic men and women that reach out to link with me, there's lots and lots of people that are in the tech industry at some level. That gives me pause to this argument, if you will, or excuse for the industry representation, because we are already here. And yet we are not in these companies, and the companies continue for the last 10 years to say they can't find talent. That's not true. The talent is there. The problem is, why is this talent not being hired and nurtured, and then also given the roles to become the leaders? And I think that's the issue that the unspoken elephant in the room.
Thank you, Kimberly. Okay, I want to go to Esther Dyson. I'm turning on your audio. Esther, go ahead.
Kimberly, this is great. I wanted to circle back to the board thing, and just, it's worth kind of thinking about the issue of, if you have one Black board member, they kind of like, they represent all Black people. And it's really important for these poor white minds to see that, you know, they don't all think the same, they don't all have the same opinions, and it's a sort of visceral thing. But the second issue is simply, people need support, and it's being the sole Black person or the sole whatever on a board is challenging. And I don't think the change is really going to happen until you bring someone on the board because she's a tech expert and she also happens to be Black, and she also, but we have to get beyond this tokenism, because it doesn't change things. And I'm sorry, that was supposed to be a question. So
No,
your thoughts.
I
Good. Go
agree.
ahead.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think about, and to one of your points, someone asked me recently that I know Mae Jemison, and I was like, of course I know Mae Jemison. Like, what African-American woman who's in STEM doesn't know Mae Jemison? And they was like, do you know her? And I was like, yes, I interviewed her before. And one of the things about that interview that I'll never forget is that I wanted to talk to her at some point, and my questions about her experience as a Black woman in the field and the things she overcame and yada, yada, yada. And she was like, no, I am a doctor, I'm a scientist, I have built this company, talk about the things that I've achieved, talk about my accomplishments, ask me questions about that. And in that moment I was schooled. I was like, yes, ma'am, I will ask you those questions. And it was just what you said. It's like that when we stop looking at the negative asset framing of what these diverse voices bring to the table and talk about the skills that they bring, the talents that they bring, it shifts the conversation. And I adamantly agree that one person on the board is not enough. I remember on Twitter, someone was talking about, well, can Reddit just add 2 seats? And I was like, that's a novel idea. Like, yeah, it shouldn't just be Alexis giving up his seat, and adding one person of color. You know, maybe you all need to really add 2. You know, having more voices, because we are not a monolith. We do not all think the same just because we're Black people. We do not. So I think having that diversity of thought and opinion, even as we make these boards and C-suites more diverse, is critical to really being able to shift culture and shift the conversation.
I would just,
Thanks.
thank you, Esther. I would point out an interesting irony going back to Ken Chenault on the board of Facebook. You know, I'm a well-known Facebook critic at this point, and I believe strongly he was selected as a token gesture. But what they didn't count on is he was also the first person they had ever had on the board who had experience running a global Fortune 500 company. And so he brought in with him, not his Blackness so much as his corporate governance expertise, which was exactly why the system rejected him, which I find deeply ironic and sad. Anyway, Tony, I'm going to turn you on.
So I wanted to talk about open source projects. And, you know, these are not corporate, but they relate to corporate. So if you look at open source projects, they tend to be heavily dominated by white males. Very few women, very few minorities. And in some of those well-known projects, there are what we would call benevolent dictators for life. So this makes it very difficult for governance of these projects. And Maggie Johnson Pint said that they were inherently anti-Black. And the idea is that any system based on argumentation and single dissent isn't very good for people who are trying to avoid seeming argumentative. At the same time, being a contributor to open source projects is something that people put on their resumes, and corporations use them for hiring. So it seems to kind of all circle back. And I wondered what your experience with open source was, and go from there. Thank you.
Really good question. Thank you for that.
That's a fantastic question. We at Black Girls Code, we haven't done a lot. I would say not that we haven't done anything, but we haven't really done a lot with open source, although there definitely have been volunteers that have been part of BPC that have been heavily engaged in the open source community. We have not necessarily been as involved in the open source community as we would like to be. I think what I would say to that is that I agree with the things that you've noted. I think there's certainly been companies like Glitch, et cetera, that have really started to create a different culture around the open source side of the community and supporting those communities. We just have not seen a heavy, what do I want to say, request or invitation in for our Black creators. We
Right.
haven't seen that as much.
The great thing about that question, though, is it is indicative of just the kind of conversation that hasn't happened, that if we're really going to go deep in solving systemic racism across American global culture, but in the industry itself, that's exactly the kind of thing, among many others, that needs to be brought up. So thank you, Tony, for that. I want to now go to Steve Shapiro, and let me just quickly, there we go. You should be able to speak, Steve.
I'm Steve Shapiro. I'm from Fine Tune Learning. We're an ed tech company based in Boston, heavily involved in the K-12 world, and been watching Kimberly grow and do a great job. Kimberly, question for you is, how do you think about what other things the public school districts could be doing around building the pipeline at an early age for minority students? And is this not like an opportune time to be able to try to accelerate ways to, start younger for students, like you have done outside of school?
Well, I think one of the things that we found, David had asked a bit, and I don't know if I addressed it for him in a question earlier, how has the pandemic or the world, maybe we're just talking about the protest, but the first impact to the work of Black Girls Code for us was the pandemic, because all of the events that we have done, we primarily would do are in-person events, and they have 100 students in them in those events, just 100 students, plus those volunteers on top of that in the course of a weekend. In all of the chapters. So we had to stop doing that when the pandemic hit. And one of the things that we noticed or that we recognized is that not all of our students are connected. Not all of our students have devices. Not all of our students have access to broadband internet. And we could not, even though we went virtual and we started to do workshops virtually and reaching thousands of students in the course of one hour segment, not all of our students are being able to tap into those resources. So I think about it from the school system, like how can we drive policy to help our students with those access to the resources that they need to be technically engaged? How are we making sure that everyone, if you give them an iPad, that they have some place where they can go home and actually use it? I think that's the biggest disparity that we're seeing with students of color now, that everybody is forced to tap in. Our students can't. And what does that mean for them if you're teaching them one thing in the classroom, but they can't go home and get on the internet and do their work, or they can't go home with a device and learn the code? That is a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. I think we also need to address, cultural relevancy and wraparound services, because students that are living in the space now that we're in and seeing all the impacts, emotional impacts to them as students, how does that show up when they're in the classroom? Are there wraparound services that support those students being nurtured to the point that they can sit down and learn how to code in Java, learn how to do Python? How can you do that if emotionally, your social emotional piece is missing a key element? And how do we engage in making sure that those services are provided as necessary from our schools? So it's not necessarily, I think, that schools need to become more technically informed or more technically powered than they are. I don't think that tech is the answer. I think it's about how we support and nurture the whole child and all the elements so that they can show up as their full self in the classroom and have the tools and resources they need to be able to be fully functioning and successful.
Couldn't agree with you more.
Thank you, Steve. Okay. Dion Davis I'm just waiting for some responses on people I've been asking would they like to talk and ask their questions. So Dion, you're unmuted. Please go ahead with your question or comment.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning, Kimberly. So my question is, why do you believe that most companies associate the Black C-suite representatives or tag the Black C-suite representatives with the position of diversity and inclusion?
That's a hard answer.
No. We talked about this when Dave and I were talking earlier this week because it came up because we were talking about one particular company. I don't want to say who it was. We were talking about one very large San Francisco-based tech company that it's done a lot of work in supporting community efforts around tech, getting tech in schools and getting coding in schools, and is a very prominent philanthropist. And we were talking about this company because they've done some good things around diversity and inclusion. You know, they looked at all of the salaries to level up women according to their male peers in their organization. You know, they have a very prominent and influential chief diversity officer that sits in their C-suite. But when we were talking about him, I went to their page, I saw that, to Esther's point as well, he was the only person in the C-suite. He's the only person of color in the C-suite. He was the only Black person in the C-suite. And I found that disappointing because I know this particular company is actually relatively progressive on these issues. And even though the CDO is highly respected in the field and really phenomenal as a leader, it bothered me as an engineer because I am a trained engineer. I've spent years in industry, high-tech industry, biotech industry, chemicals industry. And for me, I want to be able to be in that C-suite from that level of expertise that I have. Yes, I am a Black woman, but I'm an engineer. I'm proud of that fact. I have expertise to bring to the table. I think that office, so that's a long-winded way of saying that I think that's the easy choice for most companies, is to hire a chief diversity officer. And if they're lucky, they get to be on the C-suite and report directly to the CEO, which is often not even the case. But that doesn't mean that the talent is not there. It's obvious that it is there. When we look at people like Ken Chenault, when we look at people that are now C-suite leaders or close to C-suite leaders like Stacy Brown-Philpott from TaskRabbit, whose specialty is in operations, and she's the CEO before she became the CEO, or Susan Chapman Hughes, that is still at American Express. We have senior leaders that are prominent and experts in their field. However, they're not being moved into that C-suite at the rate that we need to see them. And they're certainly not being able to move into the CEO seat. And that's the systemic issues that we're talking about.
I was just hearing that Ken Fraser at Merck is actually doing some quite powerful things right now. So when they rarely do get to the top, they can have some impact, which is great. I wanted you to go back to something you did tell me on the phone You mentioned early in this discussion that when you started, people were telling you to change your name. But you were told that even more recently. Could you just tell that story about the UK example?
Yeah, I was sharing with David that, certainly, as I mentioned, that in the beginning, people would be very uncomfortable with the name of Black Girls Code. And it's interesting when I tell that story, because when I tell it often in detail, I mention that, well, you need to understand that the person that told me that it should be called Black Girls Code was not even a Black woman. This was a woman who was a colleague that I had met and had a conversation with. She was not a Black woman, but she understood how powerful that could be for us to brand the organization that way. And she encouraged me to lean into it, to be fearless and lean into that. And I did, and I'm so glad that I did. And we've always gotten these troll comments in about the work, but it was especially prevalent in the earlier days when people didn't see our work. They didn't know what we were about. It's less obvious now, but we don't get them as much. But I did get one. I did get some pushback from a corporate partner that we were looking to do some work with in the UK just about 2 years ago. And we were recommended by the colleague in the US to the colleague in the UK because we wanted to do some work there. And they generally said that we should probably change the name of what we're doing before we came over there, because it would not be received well. This was a senior leader at a major US base, but also a branch in the UK. So, I mean, I think that perspective is still very relevant even today, even with things that are happening around us, that this issue around this discomfort with embracing race as a key attribute is something that many of those folks that are in positions of authority in many tech companies and other companies as well are still very uncomfortable with.
Well, we're coming close to the end, and I think we've gone through a lot of the audience questions. Is there anything else that you would have us know or leave us thinking about, Kimberly? I can be quite certain most of the people on this are white people who are hoping to do the right thing, I believe. But give us a little final thought, because we need your thoughts, and I'm so pleased that we've heard it today. You've been eloquent, and it's one of my favorite sessions we've had, so thank you for that. But any final thoughts?
I guess we've spoken about so much, but I think my final thoughts is that everyone can do something, right? There's something, you have to find what that thing is that you can give. Is it your time? Give that. If it's your resources, give that. Do you have a position of authority that you sit in? Well, give up and make space for someone else. You have to find a way to move into this moment, not as an observer, but as an activist. So this is how you finding the way for you to be the everyday activist that you can be, and use the power and privilege that you have to really, really evidence some change in your sphere of the world. And I think everybody needs to get up at this moment and lean in and figure out what that is, and then you need to do it.
Great way to end. Thank you so much.